Welcome to the Forest School Podcast, a show where I, Lewis, and my co-host, Wem Southerner, set out to explore a shared pedagogy. It's a space where cerebral thinking matters more than craptivities, where educational purpose outweighs pretty resources, and where inclusion is more than just a buzzword. Join us as we overthink the trivial, deep dive into whatever sparks our dopamine, and reflect on what it means to truly hold space for others, holistically and without judgment. Thanks for being here. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Like to do something that I should have done before I press the button, right as I press the button.
Now everyone's wondering what you're doing. Picking your nose, scratching your bum. Listeners, hi. We are here today with Tilly Tilbrook. And Tilly is an ecologist, and she has her own company, IES Consulting, in the West Country of the lovely England. And we wanted to speak with Tilly today, partly because of all of the stuff that's in the news at the moment about the planning infrastructure bill, but also about the kind of current state of UK wildlife and nature and lots of other things that are kind of relevant to those of us that work outside or have an interest in nature. So first of all, Tilly, thank you for coming on. And do you want to tell us a little bit about sort of your job, yourself, your career, how you got to this point, and what you do? Because not everyone is going to be aware, I'm sure, of the role of an ecologist in the UK.
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing this job for about 23 years now. I started off as a county ecologist working for a county council over in Northamptonshire, which I did for a couple of years. I arrived as their biodiversity action plan officer to implement their biodiversity action plan. And then I arrived and someone dropped a lot of planning stuff on my desk and said, "We don't have a county ecologist. This is also your job," which I was woefully underqualified for straight out of university. But I had great colleagues in the Wildlife Trust who essentially held my hand and made sure I knew what I was doing. And then I've moved over into consultancy, which is what I've been doing for about the probably last 20 odd years. I've worked small consultancies, large multinational consultancies. I've run my own business now, and I've also been seconded over to DEFRA. So I did some ministerial briefings in DEFRA. I helped with the State of Nature report that looked at the England Biodiversity Action Plan and how well that was working. And I also did a stint of about 2 years part-time in Natural England working on landscape scale nature restoration schemes, which were called nature recovery areas. So I've done a lot of different things in my time as an ecologist, but now I concentrate on commercial development projects. So we do everything from going and looking at a site before any building has even happened, and sometimes before people have even bought the land, to look at what might be there, what the constraints are, what sort of things they'll need to do to stay within the law, right through to getting planning and putting all the information in for that. And then we do a lot of the post-planning work as well, where we will oversee work on site to make sure that people aren't doing things like affecting nesting birds or any protected habitats or species. So we're out on site watching the machines work, and we do a fair amount of rescuing wildlife, putting newts in buckets and moving them somewhere safe.
Oh, that's amazing. So you're kind of on that strategic side as well as the hands-on, quick run, there's a
yes
there's a harvest mouse.
Yeah.
Somebody catch it. That's so cool.
Exactly. We do everything because it's quite a small company. We tend to go from the survey work right through to the delivery of the projects.
Yeah, nice. Can you tell us a little bit about your kind of most interesting bits of career, your most memorable like animal encounters or bits that you've really enjoyed?
So the best part of the job is definitely getting to actually see and handle the wildlife. We get to handle wildlife that most people don't even get to see, let alone touch. I love dormice because quite often, firstly, they're the rodents that don't bite. They very rarely bite you, which is wonderful.
Really?
But also you find them quite often early in the season in a state called torpor, which is sort of semi-hibernation. And it takes them about 15 minutes to wake up from that. But it means that basically you can pass dormice around. They're like little furry table tennis balls that you can pass around all curled up and asleep in your hand. And they don't really wake up whilst you do that, which is great. You do need a license or to be with someone licensed to do that. But I think my favourite story is I was on a bat transect one year, and we're walking around and it's the middle of the night and we're looking for bats and we're recording the bats, and we've all got radios to keep in contact with the other surveyors. So we were each on our own doing different bits of the site but talking to each other on the radio. And the radio comes crackling into life, and someone's like, "Has anyone seen that fox?" And I was like, "Yeah, the fox has just come over next to me." And the guy on the other end went, "Well, he's just stolen my bloody pork pie."
Oh my God. We've been in places, Lewis, where squirrels have stolen your lunch, haven't we?
Oh my God.
Did they open the zip or did they chew through the zip?
It was so fast. We were on a scout, it's like a multi-use scout site. So all the scout troops in the area had like a little, I'm going to call it an alcove, but by the alcove I mean like a, 100-meter square bit, and then you go down the path and the next group's got another one, and we were setting up to do, it was I think a play forum for play workers, and we were set up quite in one of the alcoves quite far away, walked maybe 50 meters, and then went, "Oh, I forgot that thing, we need to take that with us." Came back and squirrels had gone through a zip and then into another bag with a zip, like through it, and found like a French stick and a bar of chocolate and were running off with it. And
Amazing.
We can't have been gone more than 2 minutes. Like, these squirrels were so well trained from being at scout group that they were like, we know exactly how to get into rucksacks, we know what we're doing, like military operation. It makes me think, Tilly, do you have to do a lot of, I watched a program that was on BBC the other day with, I forget the actor's name, she was Stacey in Gavin and Stacey, and she went round and went to like a wildlife sanctuary and rehabilitation thing. It was almost doing like work experience there. And throughout the show, it's like 8 episodes long, and even still at the end of it, she was getting told off because she kept trying to talk to the animals, she kept trying to like cuddle with them, and all of the staff were going like, "No, these are going to be like released again. You can't let them get friendly with you. You can't let them see you as a friendly thing. They need to be an appropriate amount of wary of humans." Is that something that comes up in your work, or is that a slightly different bit of work?
Yeah, it doesn't, because we tend not to be out in the same places enough for the wildlife to get too used to us. But I am always like, can we not try and feed the squirrels? Don't feed the squirrels, because the squirrels will come and just steal your tracker bar at lunchtime. The ones in Bristol are really brave. They'll run up your leg now to steal the tracker bar out of your hand. But on our kind of surveys and development sites, we're never really there long enough or enough times for the wildlife to get habituated to us being there.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, not like at forest school where the relationship between like humans and animals is really interesting there at forest school, I think, and it's like making decisions like, do you feed the birds or do you not, and how close you get to things. You mentioned licenses, and go on, Liz, you were going to say something.
No, this is absolute tangent. It's not what I'm interrupting for at all. But I was just going to say that I've recently because you said bird feeders. So we've had these bird feeders, and I've tried everything for years to try and, especially in a wood sense, what can we do to limit the amount that the squirrels get whilst feeding the small birds? Which we've done very well, because we've also had sparrowhawks move in this year, which is a bad thing. It's not necessarily great for those little birds, but it does mean we have supported that population. But I recently did the thing where I've covered all the bird seed in chili powder, because birds can't taste chili, but the squirrels can.
Right.
And it's massively helped. Like, the bird seed is lasting way longer. The squirrels are, at the moment, they're trying to deal with it. But I also recently found out that there are some squirrels that will go for chili powder bird seed more. Like, they get a kick out of it and are like, yeah, let's have some of that. Like, there's ones like, but the ones that have been too close to a Nando's, I'm assuming, have just developed a taste for it. That's all I was going to say.
It's probably just a matter of time, isn't it? They're like freaking out first of all, and then they're like, it hasn't killed me. Maybe I like it now.
Yeah, and I always think with things like squirrels, like, there's a lot of them, and they can kind of look after themselves. So if we feed them and get a bit close to them, it's probably okay. They're not the ones that we need to worry about particularly. We've just got a bird feeder at work, because my staff saw some squirrels the other day and were so delighted by the idea of putting something out that the squirrels and the birds would eat that I bought them a bird feeder. So now they're just feeding the squirrels here.
going back a bit to like protected species and licenses and stuff. I think again that's something that maybe unless you work directly with animals, people kind of know about protection for bats. I think just especially from a planning point of view, and there's quite a lot of like, I mean, we haven't got started on the political stuff yet about like politicians saying bats and newts are the bane of the earth and things like that. Anyway, but people like to joke about bats having, you know, more protection than people and all these silly things. But apart from bats, like what other species are protected in the UK and how?
So there's a whole bunch of protected species in this country. So obviously there's all the different bat species, but also reptiles are all protected. So varying degrees. So down sort of in Dorset and the Heathlands, you get smooth snakes. You don't get them very many other places. They are really protected. You need a license to survey and handle them. But all the other reptile species are also protected. And whilst you don't need licenses to handle them and survey them, they are protected by law. And then there's great crested newts, which are a European protected species. There are dormice, they're protected. You need a license to survey for those. Otters, water voles, which are the species that have the best PR out there because everyone thinks they're cute and fluffy and delightful, and they would actually have you. They are very vicious. Badgers, yeah, they're really vicious. When you're trying to translocate them, you have to put them into Pringles-tubes because you can't have them anywhere near you. You have to catch them by their tails and put them into a Pringles tube.
That's also how you have to move me, though. When I need to be relocated, a tube of Pringles is part of the deal.
The Pringles tube is the exact right size to fit a water vole in, so it can't turn around and bite you. Because they're burrowing animals, they'll go into them because they like being in dark tunnels. That's where they go to escape predators.
Do they come out backwards, or do you have to shake them?
You sort of tip them. You tip them out, and they slide out because it's slidey in a Pringles tube.
How undignified!
I know. But if they didn't try and bite you, you wouldn't have to do it. And then badgers. Badgers are protected, but they're not protected because they're rare. Particularly, they're protected because of badger baiting. So again, you don't need a license to survey them, but you do need licenses to disturb them and close sets and things like that.
How does that work with the badger cull then? I've never understood this. How are they protected, but yet also we must exterminate them? What is going on there?
Yes. So it's really hard to explain. If you are part of the badger cull area and you are someone who is licensed to cull the badgers, you have a license to be able to go out and cull a certain number of badgers, a certain percentage of the population, which fine. But for development and damage to gardens, which is one we get called out for quite a lot, you need a separate license in order to be able to close a set. And I am not going to pretend any of this makes any sense. It doesn't make any sense that on the one hand people are killing them, on the other hand we need a license to do things to move them on. The badger cull is, I would say, on scientifically shaky ground. The links are not particularly well proven, and because of the way badger social groups operate, when you cull in an area, unless you are either in a discrete area, so it's bounded by, say, a motorway and a river, and there's nowhere else for the badgers to go, or you get a really high number of them, all you're doing is making the badgers move around more as they expand their territories to fill the gaps. So it's a political move rather than a scientific one. There was a lot of research being done into badger social groups and the efficacy and the TB links, which was being done by Professor Krebs of Krebs cycle fame, if you remember that from science at school. And he was just getting good results when the first foot and mouth outbreak happened, and all the research got scrapped at that point because it wasn't possible to do it. But yeah, it's scientifically debatable, I would say, as to how good and important and useful the cull is.
Tilly, can I ask just to get something straight before we move on? So what does the term, because I've used it and I hear it all the time, but what does a species being protected actually mean from a legal sense, from a whatever, like, because I know the term, that's a protected species. And that means there's fines for interfering, or it means that you shouldn't touch them ever, or it means what does that term actually mean?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So protected species are ones that are protected by law under various different acts of Parliament. So we've got the Wildlife and Countryside Act, we have the Habitats Regs, and then the badgers have got an act of their own. They get their own one. And what it means is that it's illegal to interfere with their resting places and their homes. Usually it's illegal to kill or injure them. It says kill, injure or take on the legislation, by which they mean you can't sort of either have one as a pet or move them around.
Like that advert that's out at the moment with the guy who thinks he's buying a puppy and it's a badger. Have you seen that?
Yes, exactly. Don't buy badgers from people in pub car parks. That's a terrible idea.
Go to a reputable breeder and get yourself a
exactly.
pedigree.
So you can't do any of those things unless you get what's called a derogation license. And the derogation license is a license that lets you do something that would otherwise be illegal. And for the protected species, it's now unlimited fines and up to 6 months in jail, but per animal. So the reality is people don't get jailed for wildlife crime, but the fines are getting bigger and more proportionate to the harm caused. So there was a one where a developer destroyed a bat roost knowing that it was there and got fined several £100,000, which was, proportionate. It was a single house scheme, I think, and so it's fairly proportionate to the money that would have been made on that scheme.
And so is that then is part of the barrier then that because those bats aren't reporting to the police? Is it because it requires a third party to say I've seen something happening and I think it's gone against this protected thing?
Yeah, so in order to get planning, you have to produce lots of ecology reports and put them in with your planning application. So that it then flags up any protected species that are on your site. You've done all the surveys, you know what's there and what's not there. The local authority then put conditions on your planning application, which you have to discharge in order to be able to either build the thing or live in the thing, or rent it out as office space or whatever. And they check that those conditions have been implemented. So they'll word them in such a way that it'll say, that you need to provide evidence of the license being granted and the license being implemented. And so that would be, something like a preoccupation condition, or they'll say, you need evidence that the site has been cleared according to this methodology as a pre-commencement condition. So you can't actually start any of the building work until you can provide evidence that you've done that in the right way with an ecologist on site. And then what happens is if it's going awry, it's usually the ecologists that are involved that end up reporting people. We are professionally bound to do that. So if somebody does something illegal and we know about it, we have to report it to the wildlife crimes officer and the police. It's always fraught when you have to do that. I've had to do it a few times in my career. Typically what they're looking for is a work towards restitution, but some things like the developer that just demolished the house that he knew had a bat roost in, there's no restitution that can come from that, and that was a very cut and dried case that was easy to prosecute. Wildlife crime is hard to prosecute because it's hard to prove that you've actually had the impact that is illegal.
They don't do well on the witness stand.
No.
Does that mean then that, so you didn't mention foxes as a protected species, is that right? They're not protected.
No, they're not protected. No, they're protected under animal welfare legislation. So things like foxes and rabbits, protected under animal welfare legislation. So you can't just go and get rid of a fox's set when there's cubs in there, for example. But you can exclude them at sort of other times of the year without needing any kind of license for that.
Right. Wow. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, I'm just also thinking about isn't it? It's so interesting, isn't it? The animals that are protected by law and those that are seen as pests, and you just hire a person to come and exterminate those things because they're nasty.
It tends to be the protected by law ones are the rare ones apart from badgers. Badgers are a bit of an anomaly because that is specifically because of badger baiting, and that comes under the animal welfare side of things. So that
is it
makes
worth
sense.
explaining badger baiting? We have some of our listeners aren't from the UK, and we've used badger baiting a few times, and it may be a term that might confuse people.
So badger baiting is essentially a sport in inverted commas where people go and put dogs down badger sets with the aim of bringing the badgers out for fighting with the dogs. Why badgers got that legal protection and foxes and hunting is different, I couldn't tell you.
What about hare coursing?
We could have a good old guess, couldn't we? But I think
yeah. What about hares?
Yeah, so hare coursing is not legal and is a bit of a problem. It's one of those ones that's very difficult to prove and very difficult to catch people at. So yeah,
what is coursing? Is that the same thing? Hunting
yes,
getting them out.
Hunting them. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's really tricky to see. They're protected in their breeding season from being killed, hares, and that's when there tends to be they are around. They're not. They don't have a closed season in England. They only have a closed season in Scotland. So that's a big issue for hares. So there's a closed season in various different places, but it's an animal welfare issue as opposed to a protected species issue.
Got you.
And so because you were talking about that these protected species have been protected by different pieces of legislation over the years, and sometimes it's prompted by social events, and sometimes it's prompted by lots of ecologists maybe saying like this is a big issue and it needs to be looked into. Do you, in your time working in the industry, have you seen like the impact of the protection status coming in and then the impact that it's had on populations of specific species?
Yeah, so it's definitely caused some stabilisation of some species. So some species of bats have stabilised. The problem is that the research that you need to do to look at overall population numbers is incredibly time consuming and difficult, and doesn't happen particularly regularly. So you're often working with fairly old data for population numbers. I think a really clear example of how legislation has worked really favourably environmentally is when DDT and similar pesticides were banned. You saw a massive increase over the years in otter numbers because you weren't getting runoff into the rivers anymore. And so fish numbers went up and otter numbers went up. And that in turn is then helping water voles because mink got released from the fur farms, right? Back in the kind of, when was it? 60s, 70s, 80s. Animal rights activists released mink. Laudable if you're a mink, pretty terrible if you are any of the UK native species, because mink kill everything and have no natural predators in this country, and they can do things that other predators in this country can't. So, for example, they'll swim and go into water vole burrows and kill the water voles, which lots of other things can't do. So they had a really devastating impact on water vole populations. But now that otter numbers are increasing and otters have spread back through the country, you then have a kind of impact on the water voles because the otters outcompete the mink. We don't think the otters kill the mink, but they definitely outcompete them in terms of food supplies. And so mink numbers drop and water vole numbers will go back up as a result of that.
That's a huge chain of positive impacts from just the protection of well, that's not even a protection bit at that point, is it? That's the runoff stuff then having all these knockoff things. And does that then get fed back to, like, have any parliaments been interested in having that data fed back, you know, like here's the impact of the legislation? Or is it kind of like, we did that, we got the positive praise from it, and now move on?
Yeah, I don't think an awful lot of data gets fed back to at the kind of parliamentary level. It tends to be collected in organisations like Natural England, NRW in Wales, Scottish Natural Heritage, places like that are the people who are really looking at those things in a bit more detail. For us on the ground, we really only hear about it when sort of state of nature type reports get published that look at that kind of thing. So yeah, we're working with relatively old data. One thing we do have is local record centres. So everywhere has a local record centre for environmental records. Anyone can submit data to it if you have sightings of things. And we do data searches from those to inform the work that we do, to look at what's been found locally.
Right, so that's kind of like citizen science level stuff.
Yes, but we also submit all our data from our surveys to that as well at the end of each year. So we compile a spreadsheet and submit it to each of the record centres of the areas that we work in, so that the data is out there for other people to use and collate.
Oh, I was going to say, is it like public access? Can people, you know, can anybody get to that data?
Yeah, so there's a website called the National Biodiversity Network, the NBN Gateway, and anyone can look at all the data on there. You can only use it commercially if you go through the local record centres. But if you're using it for citizen science type projects, you can download it under non-commercial use. There's a Creative Commons license on it, so you can use it for
Cool.
yeah, from that point of view, for citizen science. And then we've got a really long history in this country of volunteer groups. So a lot of the data is gathered by volunteer groups. So, you know, they are really the backbone of looking at what impact is being had on wildlife in this country. You know, there's mammal groups for most counties, there's bat groups in most counties, there's amphibian and reptile groups everywhere, and they do an awful lot of the hard work of working out, you know, what the state of play is with each of the species.
That's so cool. So with that network, is that something that forest schools could download, you know, just in terms of sharing with the children the information that, like, actually our wider area is seeing a lot of otter activity, like, over the years? Or does it show kind of trends and stuff? Does it?
Yes, so you can filter it by year and by distance from your the point where you are, and you know, by type of record. So for example,
so cool.
Badgers are often roadkill. So but you can then filter by other sort of things like that. The level of detail you get depends on the species. So they redact some of the level of detail, so you'll never get like individual set information for badgers, because then obviously it could be used against the badgers. But other things, other things will come down to site specific.
Would that be the same for adders?
I don't know.
They're really in trouble, aren't they? And I know
they are really in trouble.
I feel like they should, you know, if you see one, you shouldn't be too specific about where you've seen it, because some people are still so frightened of adders that they'll want to kill it.
You can submit your data with as detailed a grid reference as you want to the local record centre, which is how it will then get onto the NBN gateway, without concern about that, because they will redact it themselves. So they will put it in at a level of detail. And what it means is, if you need to see the data at a greater level of detail, you can request that. You just don't put it into public reports, so that it's not out there for everyone to see. So for example, when we do a report on a site, if there's badger information, that tends to get redacted. So all planning application information is on the planning portal. Anyone can download any planning application and read it. But our reports will, the planners will redact so the sensitive information like badgers and things like that.
Yeah. I was speaking to a bird watcher who I came across on the coast path in Cornwall one time, and he was watching peregrine falcons, and he said to me, you know, I can tell you what I'm looking at now, and I can tell you that that's a roost, but I can remember the time where I wouldn't have been allowed to tell you what I was looking at, and I couldn't be, you know, because there were I think there were 2 pairs left in the UK, and he was sort of employed to survey them, and he knew where they were, but he had to sign secrets acts and stuff to protect them because people were still kind of into collecting the eggs and stuff. But yeah, it's birds of prey have also had big upswings, haven't they? Since other pesticides have been banned.
Yeah, absolutely. The bans on pesticides and the bans on killing birds of prey in game bird areas on the moorlands has had a big impact. It still happens. That's one of the more frequently reported wildlife crimes, actually, is the killing of game birds, or birds of prey rather, on game bird areas, like on grouse moors and things like that. But yes, certainly things like red kites, for example. There were 2 big reintroduction sites. There was the red kites at Rockingham and then the one in Wales. And since then, they have spread across the south, really, really well. And they're starting to move into sort of most areas. We've got one really nearby here. It hasn't quite made it to where I am, but it's just over the hill. I see it sometimes over the other side of the hill. So they've made a resurgence. And buzzards, which, when we were kids, you very rarely saw a buzzard, whereas now they are absolutely everywhere.
Yeah, I can remember my dad pulling over the car and going, "Look, there's a buzzard! Oh my God, look everyone, how beautiful!" And it's now.
Are we not supposed to do that anymore? I still do that all the time. Constantly.
Amazing.
Tilly, do you think that because we're saying all this data exists and it's all being collected, but it's being collected, like you said, by volunteer organizations or by like third-party organizations? Do you think that, because one of the things that we want to talk about is obviously this bill that's being put forwards, which is really looking at these kind of protections and weakening a lot of them. Do you think that some of that is because it's held by third party rather than the government taking it in-house, or do you think it always would have been seen this way? What's your take on that?
No, so I don't think the data being collected and held by third parties is really the issue. I think the from the planning and infrastructure bill point of view, ecology is a scapegoat. I don't think what they're trying to do will have the impact they think it will, or that they want it to, because I think they don't understand the issues and have really got themselves lost in the weeds on this one, and it's become a political talking point rather than based on any kind of evidence. They are talking about problems that existed when I started in the industry. They're not problems that exist now.
Can you tell us some examples of what issues are being brought up?
So you'll all have seen the how many £1 million bat tunnel for HS2, and the rhetoric that's coming from Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer about bats and newts holding up development. It's just not true. It's simply not true. There is no evidence of it at all. The government's own advisory body has said there is no evidence for it, and those of us that work in the industry know there's no evidence for it. And things like, the HS2 bat tunnel, that no ecologist sat down and specified a tunnel costing, tens of millions of pounds. Was it £100 million bat tunnel? No ecologist.
Can you tell what?
So there is an HS2. There is a bat tunnel to do with HS2. So HS2 is going through an area of ancient woodland that includes these very rare bats.
Right.
Okay, and because that's the route that they've decided to take, some kind of mitigation has to be put in place for bats. Now, what that looks like is not prescribed by anyone. And whilst Natural England said, yes, this would be acceptable, what they didn't say is this is the only thing that would be acceptable. And it's been used as a bit of a political football, really, by saying that, how can it be right that we've had to spend £100 million on a tunnel for bats? And the answer is you didn't have to spend that. The answer is you decided to spend that because it was cheaper to do that than to move the route of HS2 so that you weren't impacting those bats.
Right.
And given that you are impacting them, you then have to do something. And this is what people have come up with. It won't have been the only solution, but it'll have been the solution that would work in the time available.
So what? It's a tunnel that goes. Available. Sorry, I'm going off in the weeds. It's a tunnel that goes what? Like under the road? or the road?
No, no. Do you know what? I actually don't know, because I have tried to sort of
Maybe because we've
tune it
talked
out
about it. In
somehow.
my head, I'm imagining giant Pringles-tube with the road going over it like a
It's
humpback bridge. That's what's in my head.
so basically it's a shield so the bats don't get hit by high-speed trains.
Right.
So it's not
Like
a
a
tunnel
roof.
for bats, it's a roof for the train line so that
Okay.
the bats fly over the top and don't get hit by trains. So it allows them to
The
cross
train
the
goes
high-speed
through the
line.
tunnel. Got it.
Exactly, but it's been called a bat tunnel, so now everyone thinks it's a tunnel for the bats. It's not a tunnel for the bats. It's a tunnel for the train. It's a tunnel where the train doesn't need to have a tunnel except to stop the bats
I
impacting it.
see.
And
Yeah.
the only reason, so bats are really good at avoiding stuff, right? That's what they do. That's their thing. But they can't avoid high speed trains because they're high speed. And because the high speed trains will run late into the night, there has to be some way of mitigating for the fact that you would otherwise have deaths of these incredibly rare bats from impacting the train. Now, that tunnel was not designed by an ecologist. It was designed by an engineer. And it was costed by engineers. It had nothing to do with ecology. The ecologist said you need a way to stop bats from impacting, or the trains from impacting bats. You don't want the trains to hit the bats. It's going to kill the bats. That's very bad. If you must put your train through this wood, then you've got to do something to stop the train hitting the bats. That was what they came up with.
Yeah.
But that didn't need to be the solution. A solution could have been going around that wood, for example.
Oh my God. So with this planning and infrastructure bill, what are they proposing to do? For those of us who might not have sort of read it in detail, what are the main concerns, let's say, because the bill's quite massive?
Yeah. So the bill covers an awful lot of different things, and there are big chunks of it that are absolutely fine, but it has a part called Part 3. And it's Part 3 of the planning and infrastructure bill that we're all concerned about, because it removes a lot of the protection for nature conservation. So it removes an awful lot of the things that are currently enshrined in legislation, and it puts some of them into policy, which is a much weaker way of doing things because it's much easier to change policy without scrutiny than it is to change primary legislation. So primary legislation can only be changed by going through Parliament. So there's scrutiny there. It goes to the House of Lords. It gets debated in the Commons. There's chances for amendments and things like that. Policy can be amended, at will pretty much, and is not subject to the same scrutiny. So I'm going to have to start from outside the planning and infrastructure bill to explain this. Currently enshrined in policy and all the protected species legislation that we've been talking about is a thing called the mitigation hierarchy. And the mitigation hierarchy says that you must first try and avoid your impacts. So do you put your high-speed train line somewhere else so that it won't impact the bats? That's avoidance. Can you build this somewhere else in order that you're not getting rid of this very nice grassland, for example? The next one is minimize. So that is, okay, you know what your impacts are, but what can you do to minimize those impacts? So can you change the orientation of your building, for example, so that you're leaving more of the grassland behind? So that's the next step. The next one is restoration. So you're going to trash everything, but what can you put back afterwards? And what can you improve afterwards? What habitats are you retaining on site that you could improve? And the final one is offset. So you've been through all the other stages and there's nothing you can do on site. What are you going to do off site to offset your impacts that you're having on the animals? So for example, let's say I've got a population of slow worms on my site. I can't avoid harming them. It's a small site. I can't minimize the impact because otherwise the development couldn't go ahead. There's nothing left to restore, but what I can do is move them somewhere else to a habitat that I've improved for them, and I can then offset the damage by improving that habitat to a state where I've maybe put some high vernacular in for them so that the population can grow in that area. So that, And that's embedded into everything. So it's embedded into all our primary legislation, like the Wildlife and Countryside Act. It's embedded into all our licensing processes, and it's embedded into our planning policy. What the government are trying to do with part 3 is to replace all that stuff with a thing called an environmental delivery plan. Now, I'm going to be light on detail here because the government are light on detail. They have not explained what will be in an environmental delivery plan. They have just said it will cover an area, unspecified what that area will be. They haven't told us. And it will cover things which could be put into an environmental delivery plan and offset by a nature restoration fund. So you are effectively skipping the first 3 steps of the mitigation hierarchy. Oh, wow. You're not trying to avoid anything. You're not trying to minimise your impacts. You're not trying to do any restoration. You're going straight to offset. So it's become known as cash to trash because the developers pay into a levy, and then they can trash the place and they can do what they like. There's no, as far as we can tell at the moment, because again, there's no detail, there's no requirements for any timing. You can just go in and destroy your site without any regard for what is there. The Nature Restoration Fund, we have no real faith that the government will administer it properly. So there was a water fund, which was there because the water companies polluting rivers, bad thing, were fined, and the money went into a fund that was due to be paid out. There was £11 million in this fund due to be paid out. The decision was supposed to be taken last summer, and it was only within the last month that they've actually started paying anything out for these water schemes and restoration schemes around sort of water bodies. If they can't even administer that, which already existed and had £11 million in it and was ring fenced for a water project, I have no idea how they think they're going to administer a nature restoration fund that does not currently exist and that has no basis in anything at the moment, and how they're going to pay that money out.
And the thing is, once they're gone, they're gone, aren't they? Right? Like,
yes,
you can't just
that's the next problem.
Okay.
Exactly. So the next problem is that they have they're not planning to front load it, by which I mean, I can see a way where this would work if they said, right, for these specific impacts, we are taking a levy from you, but you can't do anything until we've created the habitat somewhere else. And we've seen that the species populations have started to increase in those areas, and therefore it's working. So that would be front loading the system. There is no proposal to do that. In fact, it can be up to 10 years before the restoration happens under the fund, which is frankly too long because nothing will be there. You can't restore something that no longer exists because it's extinct, whether that's locally or nationally.
That's reintroduction at that point. Surely that's a different.
It really doesn't work. The government are standing up and saying this is a win-win for development and nature conservation. And that it's all fine. It's all going to be completely fine. It doesn't lessen. They've stood up and categorically said this does not lessen or weaken environmental protections. There have now been 3 opinions from barristers that say it definitely does. It definitely weakens our environmental protections. They are being taken to court by Wild Justice, who are Chris Packham's group who challenged the government and do judicial reviews, but they're being taken to court because of that kind of misleading statement, which they keep repeating. So that's in the process at the moment. And there are certain things for which I can see how this environmental delivery plan and a nature restoration fund would work. Okay, so it would work, for example, for things like nutrient neutrality, which is about not having phosphates and nitrogen going into water bodies, which then damages them. Now that's a very discrete process in a very discrete area. We know what the catchments of rivers are, all that kind of thing. That's much easier to make it work within that area. We can't make it work for things like bats, and I don't see how we ever could. There are certain species of bats where we have no idea where they go and hibernate. We don't know where they go. No one's found where they go. So if you don't know where they are, you don't know whether they're in your area or not, and you've then got an environmental delivery plan that people can just pay into there's a lot of uncertainty there, effectively, and it's a very regressive step to have done that.
So I've seen the Wildlife Trust kind of campaigning and saying, email your MP to tell them that this is not on and this is not good. Are you aware of any other kind of campaigns to change this, to stop it? Apart, you mentioned the Chris Packham and Wild Justice, but
yeah. So there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes the organisation that is my governing body is the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. So they're doing a lot of work behind the scenes. There's Wildlife and Countryside Link who are doing a lot of work behind the scenes for this. And then there are a lot of professional ecologists lobbying their MPs. So I've been lobbying my MP quite hard. I've been for a meeting with him. I'm trying to get another meeting with him now. The reality is that we are now at the report stage of the bill. So it's had its debate in Parliament earlier this week. It's now, none of the amendments that were proposed that would have improved Part 3 have been accepted. They've all been voted down. It's now gone to the House of Lords. So it's in the House of Lords where we hope that, ironically, the unelected part of the government will actually put a stop to some of this. But we're relying on that now because the government is dead set on this and have just basically said we're going to do this whatever, regardless. They put a whip out so their MPs had to vote with them. And they, even when their own MPs have tabled amendments, they've rejected them. So we're now in the hands of the Lords to see what amendments they put forward, whether they vote for it or against it, and we wait to see the outcome.
My God. So if we're kind of talking now about protecting wildlife in any way we can, because it's not great already and it's potentially going to get much worse for creatures around us if this goes through. I think there's Forest School obviously tries as much as possible to involve groups in kind of habitat creation or maintenance or just awareness. What would you say if somebody has kind of limited time, limited funds, and is thinking about, I don't know, an average UK woodland with maybe, if you're lucky, a little bit of grassland attached to the side? If there was a handful of things that you could really prioritise in terms of helping any animals that are at risk, what would your advice be to really focus on?
So I think when you've got things like woodlands, it's slightly different because they're more established habitats that actually have nature value in and of themselves. And the small things you can do in there is, when you're sort of risk assessing, does dead wood need to come out or can it be left standing? How much can you buffer the activities that you're doing? So is there a part of the wood that you can visit less often, for example, so that the wildlife has a chance to establish in those areas? Certainly on grasslands, there's lots of things that you can do with grasslands, which is, if you've got a bit of grassland attached to your wood and you don't know how nice it is, seeing if you can count the different species you can see, even if you can't identify them yourself, and then doing things like, for example, you might be able to reduce some mowing in the area. If you've got some grassland that's much more of that kind of amenity grassland, like football pitchy, playing fields type grassland, plant a little patch of wildflower meadow, and then you can use that to compare butterflies there with the patch next to it. So it's much more, I think, on the small scale about involving people so that they think these things are important, so that especially children grow up to lobby their MPs themselves. And especially if you are in an urban area where there's much more of a disconnect from nature, because often the green spaces are either difficult to access or heavily managed, or areas where you might not want to go, then finding a way to connect to those is a good thing, and it doesn't need to look like anything huge. You can make, for example, you can make a beetle bucket where you drill some holes in the bottom of a bucket, bury it in the ground, put some rocks and stones and earth in, and sort of cover it over loosely with earth, and then you get lots of things like beetles and centipedes and things like that using it, which doesn't take a lot of resources or a lot of space. And then you can go and look at that and see what you've got crawling around in it or by it, and really kind of look at what you've got where you are. It's really easy to get caught up in the idea that everything needs to be huge, grand scale, and that's lovely and laudable, but the average person can't do that.
What is your personal opinion about bug hotels?
I have no strong feelings about them. I have no strong feelings about them. I have no strong feelings. There's two kind of sides to it, aren't there? There's the people that say they're really great, and then there's people that say they're spreading disease for
I've not heard that.
insects. Yeah, just because you get insects in much closer proximity often than you would normally.
Well,
but yeah, what's your...
Well, that kind of answers my question, because I kind of feel like they've gone mainstream, man. Bug hotels, they're everywhere now. Everyone knows about bug hotels, and to the fact that you can buy them in like Home Bargains or whatever, like these kind of things. There's factories in China making bug hotels, which is kind of weird. But I wonder, like, whether they are actually ever like used, where kind of thing where like you might go, oh, I'm in charge of this patio, and it's a patio with some concrete, but I'm going to go to Home Bargains and buy a bug hotel, and look, it's great now. And whether, do you know what I mean? Like, I just want,
so
used as like disposable. I see so many bug hotels where people get them one summer with the best of intentions, and then it goes through quite a difficult winter, and then it's the most dilapidated looking thing.
Well, maybe that's fine.
Wildlife's fine. Wildlife doesn't need it to look like the Ritz. They're fine with it being a bit dilapidated. So they do work. They work best if you have food sources for the wildlife nearby. That is ideal. So if you're going to put it in a concrete jungle, then don't be surprised if it doesn't get used. So, even if that's just planting some tubs of wildflowers, for example, or just anything that is pollinator friendly is worth putting out there. And they don't need to be kind of big, expensive things. One of the best things you can do for insects is to just not tidy your garden too early, because a lot of insects will overwinter in sort of piles of garden rubbish, in leaf piles and stick piles and things like that. So just don't disturb those too early, tempting though it is. So but no, they do seem to get occupied.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, I guess, is that like, do you really need to go out and buy something that is called Bug Hotel with a label on it and looks a certain way? Or really, if you had a pile of old bits of crap in the corner of leaves, a couple of old bricks, it
fully sounds like you're trying to justify the crap piles in the garden. I know you're doing a grand job of it.
Is it the same? I don't know.
The moralistic crap piles now.
Yeah. So no is the answer. You don't need to go out and buy one. And in fact, one of the things that is really good for invertebrates and insects is to make a dead hedge, where you just put some stakes in the ground and then just weave.
I'm rubbing my thighs. Oh, I love hedge. So
but your dead hedge again doesn't need to look a certain way. If your dead hedge is a pile of brash in the corner of your garden, that is also fine. It's not like the insects go, well, you've not made that pretty enough. So I'm afraid that does not resemble the dead hedge I've got in my textbook over here, so I'm not going to use that.
And
the wildlife doesn't care.
Totally. And I think also that's a strong message that we can promote amongst our groups, is that actually we don't have to like buy something that has a label that is like, we can't like this, that's what I mean about that. There's something ironic about like buying something that's been shipped halfway across the world, made by people probably underpaid, stripping resources from someplace else to make this thing. And actually, we should be promoting the message that actually wildlife doesn't care what it looks like. We care what it looks like. We want our garden to look nice, and we want to be seen to be being green and ecological by having labels and making it all very clear what we're doing. But actually, we can encourage the kids to use what's there, use our common sense, find out about creatures and what they prefer, and create that habitat from there.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that, there are certain things where it's worth buying things. So, for example, bat boxes, it's worth buying them, and it's worth buying the ones that are made of woodcrete because they're more temperature stable and they last longer, and they're really good ones to have. And again, bird boxes, same thing. Woodcrete bird boxes, really good, very durable. You just need to put them up in the right orientation. So your bats want to face south or west, and your birds want to face north or east. If you put bird boxes up facing south or west, they probably won't get used because the birds do not want boiled eggs. So whereas the bats want the warmth, the birds are not keen on that. So things like that, are worth spending the money on. Things like bug hotels, if you have the money and want to have one that looks a certain way, then great. But equally, you can have just as good an impact by having a pile of stuff in the corner of your garden, and a scruffy corner is always good.
Well, that's the message for like senior leadership teams in schools and stuff, isn't it? That want forest school areas to look certain ways, is to, like you're saying, collecting the data and going, but look at how many things are in here as opposed to over there anyway. Anyway, Tilly, I'm conscious that I could happily chat to you about animals for hours and hours and hours, but we do need to let you go.
Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that you think is important, Tilly?
So one of the things that that it's worth sort of thinking about, going back to the planning and infrastructure bill, is what are the limiting factors? So I'm standing here saying ecology is not the limiting factor, because everyone understands how the system works and we're all fairly on top of that now. And whilst yes, it does cost money, lots of things in planning cost money, and that's not a reason to scapegoat it. But what is the limiting factor? So we've got a huge shortage of planners in this country. It's planning times are really, really long. There is a huge shortage of labour post-Brexit for actually building things. There's a shortage of materials. So even if you wanted to build 1.5 million houses in the next parliament, I don't know where they think the labourers and the actual stuff to build the houses is going to come from. The elephant in the room is money and house prices. So there's not a help to buy scheme at the moment. And commercial house builders can't get funding unless they've got a 20% return on investment. That's what they need to be able to show. So they have no vested interest. There's no incentive there to flood the market with houses and drive prices down, because the cost of labour is still high and the cost of material is still high. So how do you hit that 20%? And it's not unethical to need your business to be profitable. That in and of itself is not an unethical thing. The part 3 of the bill is going to increase uncertainty and costs, and I don't think that the commercial house builders are going to want to build that number of houses unless there is some kind of concurrent help to buy scheme that keeps house prices where they are, because they won't get the funding to do that. And the reality is that with all this uncertainty being introduced, it's likely to have the opposite effect on planning, because in the grand scheme of a planning application and building a house and building a housing estate, for example, 4 years is nothing. And if you decide to wait it out and see what happens, that's what you're going to do. And what they will find is that the builders will start thinking, well, maybe let's just wait it out and see what the policy changes are and the legislation changes are. And then suddenly you've only got 2 years left of the parliament and you're not building 1.5 million houses in 2 years. It's simply not going to happen. And so I do think that it's very easy to blame the environment, because £10 million for £100 million rather for a tunnel to save bats sounds ludicrous, right? And I think in a cost of living crisis, we all need to acknowledge that that sounds absolutely ludicrous and unhinged to spend that kind of money on something to save bats. But the reality is, it was never the only option, and they could have done other things and chose not to, but it's an easy scapegoat. And I think I would just encourage people to be critical about what is appearing repeatedly in the media and what people want you to think as a result of that. Because what they want you to think is that the environment is expensive and problematic. And the environment is not expensive or problematic. The environment would quite like it if we just left it alone. It doesn't really need us to be heavily involved in it. We only need to be involved in it because of the things that we're doing. And when you're being constantly fed a narrative, I don't want to sound like someone who's going, don't listen to the mainstream media, because obviously that makes me sound unhinged. But the reality is, why is that story popping up again and again and again with no context around all the other decision-making processes that went into it, and with it never being flagged that things like that in HS2 were debated in Parliament? So MPs had a chance to stop it and chose not to. So why is it now the scapegoat for planning and housing development?
Yeah, maybe because they don't want to talk about Brexit and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah. Well, on that depressing note, no, it's good. It's very. Thank you so much for your time, Tilly. It's Oh my God, I could talk to you loads more. We've covered like a huge amount there, I think.
A huge amount in not very much detail, and it is a really complicated subject. So yes, I hope everyone's managed to kind of keep up with it as well, because I appreciate there's a lot of jargon in there that I've tried to not go into too much.
Yeah, no, it's great. Thank you. If do you have like social media at all for your company? If people like want to follow, do you have stuff like that, or do you not really?
Do you know what? I've got LinkedIn. LinkedIn
Excellent.
is where you will find me talking about environmental things. I am wholly terrible at all the other forms of social media.
You don't need it, man.
But
no one needs it,
the algorithm on LinkedIn really does like me, and it is a mix of political stuff and things like, the other day I was on a waterfall survey and I found a reed warbler nest, so I took a photo of it and put it on LinkedIn. So it's a really nice mix of technical stuff and nice pictures. So that is the best place to find out more about that kind of thing and to follow me.
Lovely job.
Oh, thank you so much, mate.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
See ya.
Bye.